Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. I'm so glad that you are here. I'm joining you live from LA, and please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. It's a beautiful morning over here. And for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be hosting an introduction to philosophy and theory, focusing specifically on the work of Slavoj Žižek and his Lacanian interpretation of the notion of fetishistic disavowal in relation to the pervert and the neurotic. If you're new here, welcome. This is a weekly lecture series that I've been hosting for the past 3 years now, I think. It originated when I was still working at the University of Oxford Brookes, and the pandemic forced us to close our university and shut down our classes. And so I simply started hosting online live stream lectures for anybody to access. And 3 years later, here we are, except now we're joined by people from around the world. I see India, I see Pakistan, Brazil, UK, Princeton. Hello, everybody. Yetta, hello. I see Somalia, North Carolina. So glad that we are here today. And this is going to be a 45 minute lecture. So essentially like an introductory class. If you're a beginner, you're welcome to stay. But for those of you who have followed these classes before, you will hopefully find food for thought that relates to the previous lectures. You can find all of my lectures, including my latest ebook, which is a guide to Hegel called The Night of the World, on my Patreon. Essentially, it works like this. It's an ebook subscription service where every 3 months I post a new ebook that corresponds to the previous lecture series. So even if you don't have time to watch all of the lectures, you can go to Patreon and you can find the ebook version of those lectures as well as audio downloads for every lecture and a seminar for each of them. Basically, additional learning materials. However, the gist of the thing is that these lectures are open access because I love having this Monday morning space with you to enjoy philosophy and theory and literature and art, etc. Please do stay a while if you'd like. So the point of today's session is that I would like to give you a brief introduction to Slavoj Žižek's theory of the pervert. If you will, the pervert versus the neurotic. And first, let me be very clear. These are not normative terms. In other words, they're not meant to be archetypes that tell you how to live your life. Instead, they're concepts derived from Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis that Žižek uses to make arguments about Hegelian philosophy, but also to apply them to the contemporary critique of ideology, which for Žižek is an extension of the critique of capitalism through a Marxist lens. If you're familiar or not with Slavoj Žižek's work, this is sort of the three-punch operation of all his philosophy, which is to take Lacanian psychoanalysis, Marxism, and Hegelian philosophy or idealism, and to use them in innovative ways. So essentially what I'm going to do here is give you a brief explanation of why I think Slavoj Žižek's categories of the pervert and the neurotic are interesting, and how they relate to the concept of fetishistic disavowal. But first, I wanted to start with a book that I read recently by an Italian writer called Cavazzoni. It's called The Brief Lives of Idiots. And there's a short story in this short novella that has perhaps, to my mind, the most beautiful illustration of the relationship between neurosis and perversion. We have a character, a man, who one day discovers that the earth is in fact spinning, that the earth is moving at a very high, in fact, alarming velocity. And he cannot cope with this knowledge. This traumatic knowledge for him completely disrupts his ordinary happiness. Every time he finds himself content or happy, he thinks to himself, well, but we're actually spinning at a high rate through the nothingness of space. And at this thought, he becomes deeply anxious and afraid, and he starts worrying that the Earth might collide with some other astral objects. And what's beautiful about this story is that this traumatic kernel, this traumatic knowledge that he has of the Earth spinning in space, cannot be disavowed. He's not able to perform the fundamental component of all symbolic identification in the world, which rests on this disavowal, choosing not to think about something which is traumatic for him. Instead, it becomes a hyperfixation. It becomes an obsession. He starts spending all of his waking hours studying maps and charts and astrological charts specifically, trying to figure out where the Earth is going and whether or not they're going to collide with an asteroid or perhaps even another planet. He lives in a constant state of agitation that something will happen like this. In fact, as this man walks through his day-to-day life, he becomes increasingly frustrated with those around him who seem to be unfazed by this knowledge that the Earth is hurtling through space. And he becomes angry, he becomes irate with the people who, when they learn about this, simply shrug it off. Like, so what? How does this affect me in my life? And so he becomes, in a sense, almost like a religious fundamentalist, as the title suggests here, an idiot of his own idiosyncratic faith, which is his slavish commitment to the idea, which for him is a neurotic fixation because he can't let go of it, that we are hurtling through space. And he becomes increasingly agitated with everybody who can go through life without being hindered by this knowledge. In fact, he has a son who enjoys speed, who enjoys riding his motorcycle, and he develops a hatred of his son because his son enjoys speed, whereas he is terrified by the notion of it. He says, how can you enjoy riding your motorcycle when you know that the Earth is flying around, orbiting itself at 108 kilometers an hour or something like this? Now, the key transition point in this novel, because of course, in the story, because of course this man is driving everybody crazy. He's waking up his wife at night, etc. He's obsessing about these astrological charts. At a certain point, his neurotic fixation, which starts with a hatred towards others, i.e., why can they enjoy life where I can't? How can they go through life without feeling anxious about the fact that we're hurtling through space, undergoes a transition to a certain kind of enjoyment. A certain kind of enjoyment, which is strictly speaking, the pervert's enjoyment. In other words, he transitions from the position of the neurotic, the obsessional neurotic who cannot confront the traumatic knowledge that we're hurtling through space, and then it turns around into a form of enjoyment. He realizes that there's nothing that gives him more pleasure than spending the entire day creating elaborate charts and systems by which he's supposed to calculate whether or not the Earth is going to collide with another astral object. Now, what's important here is the transition is one whereby he went from paranoia towards a sense of contentment. In other words, his hyperfixation manifested originally as paranoia. He would go to universities thinking that they had some specialized knowledge about when the world would collide with an asteroid. He would think that he would overhear snippets of conversation from people who could be scientists, who were in the know about the end of the world, and he became angry with them, like they were withholding some secret knowledge from him. They were the subject who was supposed to know, the subject who was supposed to know when the Earth would implode. But the transition he makes is a transition from this neurotic fixation on the unknowable towards the enjoyment of his own neurosis. In other words, he sits at home contentedly, like an idiot, like a fool, as the story is called, right? The brief lives of idiots. And he creates this elaborate chart. And he loves poring over the chart and reassuring himself that everything is going the right way and that the world is still turning and that, and this is crucial, that everybody else in the world is an idiot, whereas he is the only wise person. He's the only person who really acknowledges the gravity of the situation. And in this sort of narcissistic attachment, in this staring at his own belly button of his own traumatic fixation, we have here the figure of the pervert. The figure of the pervert, and let me be very clear here, the figure of the pervert as a concept is the one who derives enjoyment from his fetishistic disavowal. And this is a concept that for Žižek goes back to Freud, but also back to Lacan. The simplest way to state it in the Lacanian interpretation of Freud is that fetishistic disavowal occurs when you experience traumatic knowledge, when you experience knowledge of something that cannot be incorporated into your symbolic universe, that disrupts or shatters your sense of peace or unity. For example, the knowledge that the parent is not perfect. This essentially is the death of God, as it were. You thought that your parents were perfect, and then you realize that they are mere human beings as well. For Freud, there's a slightly more vulgar or crass way of describing this. For Freud, it's very Freudian, of course. It's the realization that the mother does not have a penis, that the child believes that everyone has a penis and the mother does not have a penis. Therefore, instead of acknowledging this fact, the penis has to be symbolically reconstituted. But we can save that for another time. The Lacanian extrapolation from this notion is that traumatic knowledge, something which cannot be incorporated into the symbolic universe, which I can talk about later how that relates to the real, therefore it can be confronted in one of two ways. Either through neurosis, which is a form of repression. Essentially, you're trying to avoid thinking about this thing. You're constituting a sense of symbolic identity around an avoidance of the traumatic object. Or the perverted stance. The perverted stance is to actually enjoy this traumatic kernel, to find satisfaction in it. And if you're curious about Žižek's application of this idea, it's part of his critique of contemporary ideology. Žižek essentially argues, for they know what they do. Instead of the biblical, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, Žižek inverts it and says, forgive them, for they know exactly what they do. Or his French version of it, relating back to the 1960s, is, Je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well that what I'm doing contributes to global warming, but I will do it anyway. I will do it nevertheless. And Žižek's argument, essentially in a nutshell, is that instead of this being something that diminishes our enjoyment, like, I'm participating in the global economy in a way that I know fuels further climate collapse, that this actually increases our enjoyment. Not because we want the world to collapse, not because we want there to be ecological catastrophe, but because our very guilt is sold back to us as a form of surplus enjoyment, which we talked about last week. For example, if you go to Starbucks and you are told that by buying a cup of coffee, you are contributing to the elimination of poverty, or if you buy a pair of socks and for a surcharge of $2, you can make them sustainably produced. It's this form of surplus enjoyment whereby you're deriving a bonus, as it were, from the idea of ethical consumption, the self-congratulatory participation in the very thing which creates the problem, but nevertheless is sold to you as being its very own solution. This, for Žižek, is Je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well, but nevertheless. And so, for Žižek, therefore, fetishistic disavowal, which, as Lacan puts it, leads you with two choices, as it were, which is neurosis, which is a kind of neurotic fixation, a repetition on the irreconcilable kernel of the traumatic knowledge, versus its enjoyment, versus the stance of the pervert. And so Žižek essentially argues that to live in a contemporary capitalist world is to be a pervert. That the only way to function today is to follow the logic of the pervert, the one who nevertheless derives enjoyment or pleasure in a situation that, strictly speaking, confronts us with the traumatic knowledge that it is unsustainable, that by its very definition, this era of consumption and of rapid industrialization cannot last, that it is causing ecological catastrophe and untold suffering for millions around the world. Now, if that sounds too grim, and if it sounds a bit like capitalism is bad bashing, it's important to note here that Žižek is extrapolating this idea for the purpose of making a Hegelian argument, a Hegelian/Marxist argument, which is, of course, Žižek's overall philosophical project. And I'm going to try to explain that briefly by means of an unexpected avenue, which is to say, by focusing on a theological argument for a moment. Now, remember, we have this distinction, which is not really a binary, between the neurotic and the pervert. Both are confronted with fetishistic disavowal, i.e. the necessity to disavow the traumatic knowledge which would undo or dismantle the subject's integrity. And the neurotic hyperfixates through a form of repetitive cycling around the origin of the problem, whereas the pervert is the one who manages to find enjoyment, a kind of perverted enjoyment in, or a surplus enjoyment in this very traumatic knowledge as such. Now, one of the things that Žižek does is that he relates this notion of neurosis and the pervert to the idea of religion versus atheism, or religiosity versus atheism, both of which have an interesting perspective, if you will, on the idea of something which cannot be known. It's often presented as a false binary, that people who are religious are people who believe in God, whereas people who are atheists are people who don't believe in God. But fundamentally, they're both trying to solve the same problem, which is the problem of the unknowable as such. Most religious people, at least religious people who have, let's say, engaged theologically with their faith, will argue that their faith is not so much a blind faith as it is a decision, if you will, to believe in something which cannot be proven, which cannot be logically deduced. In the similar way that trust is something which is essentially blind trust, i.e. do you trust me, is predicated on whether or not you choose to trust someone. The idea of faith essentially relies on belief in belief itself. You are believing on behalf of the notion or idea of communal belief. This is especially true for the contemporary Judeo-Christian faith, and especially you could argue since the New Testament, which removes the idea of a transcendental Father in the sky who is almighty, and instead we have the desublimation, the radical desublimation of Christ on the cross, and the idea of the Trinity. Now, if you're joining this class and you're relatively unfamiliar with the term desublimation, it's essentially I can explain it to you very quickly, if you will. Sublimation is a concept, a philosophical concept, also an artistic concept that goes back to a idealist or transcendental philosophical stance, which is to say that within Plato's cave, the famous allegory of the cave, the idea is that within the cave we have the world of illusion, the false world, the world of appearances, which is a metaphor, if you will, for earth, subjective existence. The people in the cave are looking at projections that are cast on the cave wall by a fire that is behind their backs. In other words, they're all being fooled, as it were. And the task of the philosopher is to exit the cave. In fact, one person will be taken out of the cave, and the task of this person, who has thereby become the philosopher, is to go back into the cave and to convince everybody else to leave, to wake up, as it were, to go out into the sun, to see the truth, capital T truth. This is a process of sublimation. In other words, we have that which is low, that which is fallen, that which is fooled, and you have to find a way to rise above it, to wake up, to emerge. In other words, to touch the sublime. And this was a logical proposition that was quite important within the classical world, both for Aristotle and for Plato. There's actually a connection here, which is that the ideal was therefore also that of the gods, the highest form of knowledge, of beauty, aesthetics, etc., and that therefore the purpose of life was to aspire to this highest form, to be reunited with the godly form, as it were. And so we have a one-directional movement, which is a movement of sublimation. Desublimation, on the other hand, would imply the opposite movement, a movement downwards. Instead of us being reunited with the gods, it's the idea of God, or the gods, or whatever you want to call it, being reunited with us. This is similar to Hegel's famous idea that what dies on the cross in the New Testament isn't so much the body of Christ as it is the idea of a transcendental deity as such. In other words, Christ represents the moment of desublimation, the moment where it isn't that Christ comes as the Savior who brings us to God, but vice versa, in a way, who brings God to us. And this is a radical disruption, if you will. It's a turning upside down of a certain metaphysical, theosophical logic, so going back to Plato, whereby we have what appeared to us as the purpose of life, of philosophy, namely sublimation, suddenly becomes desublimation. But the crucial thing, the crux, if you will, no pun intended, of desublimation is that it's not like an elevator that was going up, but now it's going down. It's that going down is precisely going up. Up is down, hence the Hegelian dialectical argument. Therefore, desublimation isn't so much the movement by which sublimation descends, but in which sublimation is only achieved through desublimation. In other words, it's precisely, to remain with the theological argument, that when Christ reunites or brings down the idea of the Godhead, the Almighty Father, through the failure, if you will, of Christ to be the Savior who appears as a Neo-like figure who redeems everyone and brings them back to God, it's precisely that God is redeemed, that God is redeemed in and through us. And so there's a massive inversion that occurs. It's essentially the New Testament suggests a post-metaphysical faith, whereby belief is not so much belief in the idea of the Almighty Father, the heavenly ideal figure who is perfect, but precisely the idea of belief in belief itself, belief in the notion of the collective, belief in the notion of the community of the faithful. In fact, to believe in the idea of an Almighty Father who has a predetermined path for righteousness that we must follow to be reunited with him, in a strictly speaking, in a sense of sublimation, becomes almost impossible after the event of the crucifixion. This is also why the French philosopher Alain Badiou refers to the crucifixion as the most important event in the history of philosophy, because it suggests this upheaval, this post-metaphysical or post-sublimation logic. The reason I'm mentioning this here is that Žižek argues that the position of the faithful, in other words, people who believe, people who are religious, thereby confronts the problem of belief, not as in what should I believe in? Should I believe in the idea of an all-powerful deity, but in the idea of belief in belief itself. Whereas the position of the contemporary atheist, and I'm generalizing, of course, but many atheists who uphold this original problem of the faith as being, do you believe in a man in the sky who can solve problems in your life if you pray to him, therefore upholds a notion of the Godhead, of the deity, that no longer makes sense from within the logic of the contemporary church, certainly the church since the New Testament. Therefore, essentially what atheists do is that atheists who are confronted with the logical disruption that the New Testament implies practice a form of fetishistic disavowal, holding on to a kind of Old Testament logic, whereby the idea of belief simply rests on whether or not you have a slavish upholding of the idea of an ideal father in the sky, and therefore resuscitate or cling on to an outdated, if you will, mode of religiosity. Now, what's important here is that these aren't terms that are meant to be normative or negative, because of course this is also how you can then understand how the argument would be extrapolated to what might appear as an anti-Semitic position, which it is not, which is to say that the inability to accept Christ as the Messiah would therefore also be a form of fetishistic disavowal. This is why Žižek says that one of the ways in which you conceptualize, slightly humorously, the difference between those who practice the Jewish faith and those who practice the contemporary Christian faith is that essentially for Jewish people, everything rests on preparation, on if you will, on the rules and regulations of a community that is preparing for a party in which the Messiah is supposed to appear but has not yet come. Whereas to be a contemporary Christian is to be confronted with a much more troubling proposition, which is that the central event has already occurred, and you're left clearing up the dishes. that it's a post-metaphysical, a post-evental faith that has to reconcile itself with what happens afterwards. This is also how Žižek chooses to read Götterdämmerung, which is the final installment of Wagner's epic opera cycle known as the Ring Cycle. That the Ring Cycle, when Valhalla burns down, essentially confronts us with the question of what happens after Valhalla has burnt down. In a weird sense, when Žižek says that the most important question is what happens after the revolution, in other words, not the day of the revolution, but the day after the revolution being the most important one, Žižek is essentially positing that the most important question of the contemporary faith is what happens after the death of God through the crucifixion. This means that any attempt to return to an atheism that simply posits the question of faith as whether or not you believe in a man in the sky who can magically solve your problems is a form of fetishistic disavowal that disavows the manner in which the faith itself has undergone a logical transition towards a post-metaphysical proposition, i.e. the notion of the Trinity. Now, ironically, you can extrapolate from this argument even a difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. G.K. Chesterton had this well-known line where he said that the Catholic faith was like a suit of armor that appears hard, but underneath there's all kinds of hedonistic excess, etc. He wasn't saying this to condemn the Catholic faith. He was actually making an argument that's very similar to the Lacanian theory of the pervert, which is to say that within the Catholic faith, we have the ability to believe in the church who believes on our behalf. In other words, through ritual, through dogma, through the sort of repetitive enjoyment of going to church on a Sunday, but otherwise getting to live... Oh, did we lose the audio? I really hope we still have audio on Instagram. I'm so sorry, guys. Someone just cold called me, and I think we lost the audio. Please do let me know in the comments if we have the audio, if it's still working. If the audio is not working, please do let me know. Apologies to everyone who's joining on YouTube this morning. It seems like we still have audio. Yes, okay, perfect. I'm very glad. Sometimes the audio goes away when I get a call. So within Catholicism, essentially, you have an institution that can believe on your behalf. And all you have to do is you have to show up. And as long as you show up, then essentially the institution will do the work for you. Of course, it's a generalization, but essentially it's relating Catholicism to a form of enjoyment, to a form of hedonistic excess, which is that, strictly speaking, if the most important part of your week is to confess your sins, then in a weird way, you can't confess your sins unless you have sinned. And so, not wanting to be too sardonic about it, but it almost encourages you to go out into the world to sin so that you have something to confess to. In fact, the more suspicious thing would be to go to church and to not have any sins to confess to, because then surely you must have something to confess to, except now you're hiding it. And so the less suspicious thing becomes to sin in your life and to then be able to confess it. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you have to leap into some kind of Sadian hedonistic excess of trying to sin as much as possible in some kind of competition. But it suggests this notion that life itself is sinful. And therefore arises, of course, the notion of Catholic guilt, which has become very infamous. But Catholic guilt, and this is really important, the notion of Catholic guilt is therefore necessary for the enjoyment, the hedonistic excess that Chesterton speaks of. No pleasure without guilt. Remember going back to Žižek's argument that it's not so much Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, but instead it's Father, forgive them, for they know exactly what they do? Pleasure is tied to guilt. Pleasure and surplus enjoyment is related to the knowledge that we know that we shouldn't do it, but we do it anyway. It's like there's a quip that Žižek has in his work where he says that if he were to be a smoker, he would quit smoking every day, because the most pleasurable cigarette is always the last one. The last cigarette, when you say, I'm never going to do it again, and of course then you do it again, is the most pleasurable one. But strictly speaking, this means that the last cigarette is also the first one. The last one that you smoke, and you say, I'll quit, is directly tied to the one that you smoke the next day, which is there for both your first and your last. And this form of surplus enjoyment, or the enjoyment of the pervert who is quitting and starting in the same time, is therefore the pleasure that comes with the guilt of the idea of confession. And this is therefore implicit and mirrors the very inversion that happens within the event of the crucifixion, namely sublimation as desublimation. Suddenly, you are confronted with, well, if there is no ideal father in the sky who I can make myself subservient to, then I'm the one who has to become subservient to myself, reenacting the faith collectively. Therefore, in a sense, it is empty, it's void, but I also derive enjoyment from the fact that it's futile, that it's void. Perhaps I'm not explaining this very well, so let's link this to Protestantism. Protestantism essentially inverts the fetishistic disavowal of the Christian faith, of the crucifixion. Protestantism says, and again, I'm generalizing, of course, but Protestantism essentially argues that we have been chosen. Some of us have been predetermined to go to heaven. But if we are predetermined to go into heaven, then surely this will manifest in good works. Therefore, we must act as if we were already chosen, thereby proving and enacting the very fate that was ordained to us, that we are chosen. In other words, by means of acting as if you were already one of the chosen ones, you prove yourself to be worthy. And so you're stuck in a neurotic enjoyment, as it were. Once again, going back to the brief lives of idiots in the beginning of the movie, we have a character who cannot live with the traumatic knowledge that we are all living on a chunk of earth hurtling through space. And he's neurotically fixated on this idea that some scientist knows the exact date when the earth will implode. And he makes the transition from this neurosis, this hyperfixation, towards perverted enjoyment by means of spending the entire day trying to calculate when this moment will occur, and being content that it has not yet occurred, that it has been deferred, and that he is the only one who's taking it seriously, i.e. that he is the one who is the scientist. Something similar occurs within the Protestant faith, which is to say, if there is no deity in the sky who has given us a bullet points of how to live a virtuous life, if it is up to us to live well, then nevertheless it holds on to the idea that there is such a thing as a predetermined outcome or destiny, which has to be manifested or proven by good works. And so the Protestant subject throws himself into ethical participation, ethical behavior that is supposed to prove to himself and to others that he is indeed a good or virtuous person. Here, of course, we also have a form of perverted enjoyment. Namely, I am not merely working for myself or working for others. I am working so as to perform what God has already determined to be true. It's like some contemporary evangelicals who say that everything that they do is for God. Oh, I made $1 million off my laborers, but I am doing it to honor God. This is a form of perverted enjoyment. This is a form of fetishistic disavowal. Now, of course, in a weird way, we have with Catholicism and Protestantism two sides of the same coin. We have the Catholic stance, which is sin, so that you might confess, and enjoy, so that, or feel guilty, so that you might better enjoy, as it were, versus the Protestant stance, which essentially argues work hard, do good labors for others, so that you might congratulate yourself as being one of the chosen ones who is doing it all for God. You have earned every good thing that has come to you, because, of course, the if you will, the idea of Satan in Protestantism is the idea of someone who receives good things who hasn't earned them, who is undeserving of that which is good. Hence why Max Weber already famously linked the so-called Protestant ethic to the spirit of capitalism, the idea that good things come to those who work hard and have the right attitude, etc. Now, the point here is that Žižek is trying to come up with a psychoanalytic reading of what is essentially a Hegelian problematic and to therefore apply it to a Marxist framework of critique. And so I'm going to try to lay that out bit by bit for you, and then we can wrap up the lecture, because it's a lot. First of all, let's rehash the beginnings. Fetishistic disavowal is the confrontation with something that cannot be reconciled into the symbolic universe of the subject. For example, I came across her, for example, in Freud. One of the earliest questions that the child has to the mother is, where do I come from? And if the mother says, you come from my belly, the child will associate the belly with food. And so the child will think, well, am I a form of food? Am I excremental, as it were? Am I something that has been ejected from you? The mother, of course, tries to explain one way or another that the baby comes from sexual activity, or perhaps doesn't try to explain this and says that the baby comes from a bird in the sky. Therefore, a fundamental gap or traumatic, if you will, lack has occurred in the child's knowledge as to its own constitution, as to its own creation. Now, of course, Freud is a bit silly when it comes to the application of these ideas in a clinical sense. Like, this is not meant to be a guide for child psychology, necessarily. Instead, what Freud is trying to point out is that one of the constitutive features of subjectivity in the child is precisely not knowing where to place his knowledge. After all, if the parent is the source of knowledge, but the parent is also the source of that which seems to contradict the knowledge, then this creates a problem for the child, a problem which Freud relates to sexuality. The Freudian notion of sexuality is never simply about touching yourself or enjoying pleasure. It's about this problem, if you will, that sexuality confronts the child with the problem of its own birth or existence, a form of disavowed knowledge at its very conception. This means that the child is confronted with what Lacan would later call fetishistic disavowal. Essentially, the child has to believe in something so as to constitute itself as a subject. And the problem here is that, strictly speaking, one can't apply a strictly speaking, if you will, logical, materialist attitude towards this. For example, if you were simply to say, well, I was born because two people copulated and I was the result of this, it doesn't tell you the full story of what it means to be a child who is essentially a slave to their parents, who has to learn what it means to be in the world through their parents, who then has to discover, as Oscar Wilde once wrote, that your parents are not perfect, and so therefore you have to transition from worshiping them to forgiving them for not being perfect. This transition that the subject undergoes is a form of trauma, if you will. Not trauma in the contemporary sense of like microaggressions, etc., but it's about being confronted with a traumatic kernel of knowledge, something that cannot be reconstituted into your subjective identification, and that yet paradoxically is precisely therefore the foundation of your symbolic identification. Once again, sublimation versus desublimation, or sublimate or desublimation as sublimation. Namely, the subject isn't something that has to be reunited with the original truth or source of knowledge, and thereby everything is fine. You are no longer a traumatic, neurotic subject, but that the very idea of subjectivity is a neurotic fixation that is necessitated by this tension with the traumatic kernel or object of your knowledge. A simple way of saying is that to be subject is to be split. To be subject is to be split between the belief in the idea of a synchronicity of your own existence and your own desires versus the knowledge of the contradictions that are necessary and constitutive of said desires. There's more that I want to explain here, but I realize I have to try to stay focused. And so fetishistic disavowal occurs when you encounter something that cannot be reconciled with the way in which you understand or experience the world. However, what I'm trying to point out is that fetishistic disavowal is necessary. For example, when I was younger, I briefly lived in an apartment complex in which there were, maybe 100 stories, like a skyscraper. And one day I was in the elevator and I thought to myself, well, strictly speaking, every apartment here is the same. Like the layout is the same. The kitchen is in the same place. The bedroom is in the same place. And so I was lying in bed and I was thinking to myself, underneath me is another bedroom with another person sleeping. And underneath them is another bedroom with another person sleeping. And as I started to think about this tower of people sleeping, all strangers to each other, going through emotions, I of course felt anxious. And so I had to learn to not think about this traumatic knowledge that was not useful in any way. And so I had to learn to practice fetishistic disavowal, which was to pretend like I was the only person in the building. This is also why Freud always equates the idea of the neighbor to the monstrous. Because Freud says that the idea of the neighbor is precisely the person who lives next to you, or in this case, underneath you, who disrupts your sense of singular unity. And yet, in a weird way, they're the neighbor precisely because you don't know who they are. Therefore, the idea of the neighbor is different from the person living next to you. The idea of the neighbor is like this traumatic kernel of knowledge that is presented to you, which is that your life is simply one amongst millions, that everything that you think is unique about yourself is somehow a refraction of the other person's similar belief that they're the main character in the world. And now, from that perspective, you should also understand why love thy neighbor is actually such a radical ethical proposition. Because to love thy neighbor is therefore to let go of the notion that you are so special, that you are the center of the universe. To love thy neighbor doesn't just mean, oh, go to your neighbor's house and loan them some sugar or something. It's a much more philosophical proposition about the impossibility of or the difficulty, if you will, of desubjectivization. One of the central tenets of the faith is essentially to become subject to another. And again, this goes back to the desublimation of the cross, not just subject to God, to the idea of a high master in the sky, because it can be very narcissistic, if you will, to say, I serve God and everything I do is for God. But instead to serve each other, to become subject to each other, which is therefore a form of desublimation, a desublimation of the idea of an ethical master who you serve, and therefore relinquishing the pleasure of the perverted pleasure of I am a lowly slave to your impulses. It's like that great scene from The Simpsons where Homer says, God, if you don't want me to eat this donut, give me a sign. And of course there's no sign, and so he eats the donut. This is the pleasure, the perverted pleasure of the master-slave relationship between the idea of a transcendental deity and you as a lowly subject. Whereas the ethical imperative of love thy neighbor is one of desublimation. Love each other, serve each other, be subject to one another, which is therefore much less satisfying, much less successful, if you will, much harder to do than to simply appease someone who will never send you a direct signal back. We send each other complicated signals all the time. As Hegel said, as soon as you speak, you are doomed, because not only have you failed to articulate what you wanted to, the other person will misinterpret you. Therefore, you have already anticipated their misinterpretation, therefore misrepresenting yourself, and you are stuck in an endless cycle of mutual misinterpretation and miscommunication. And this is what we call language. Language is the failure to communicate. If we knew how to communicate, we wouldn't have to speak. Language is neurotic in that sense. It's a cycling around the impossibility of telling people how we feel and being understood by people. Therefore, one could argue that the perverted stance on language is therefore to speak into the void, to enjoy speech for itself. And of course, what could be more perverted, what could be more speaking into the void, speech for itself, than, for example, going on Twitter and writing on Twitter your latest hot take that you think Elon Musk is going to see and repost or something, right? We're not speaking with each other. We're speaking at each other. It's a transition from the neurotic impossibility towards the perverted enjoyment. Je sais bien, mais quand même, I know very well, but nevertheless. Hence why Žižek says that perverted enjoyment is the contemporary ideological stance necessitated for participation within our society. Now, the point, therefore, is that fetishistic disavowal has to be reconciled in some way. But that from a Hegelian perspective, this is actually an important thing, a good thing. Remember, Žižek tries to combine Lacanian psychoanalysis with Hegelian metaphysics. The Lacanian argument, to simplify it to the extreme, is therefore that fetishistic disavowal, the confrontation with the lack, has to be supplemented through either the enjoyment of the lack as such or the neurotic fixation on the lack. That it has to be supplemented, it has to be substituted with something, either a radical assertion of the lack, I know very well but, or a radical negation of the lack. I cannot compute, essentially, that there is a lack. I have to pretend like it doesn't exist. And that in Hegelian philosophy, the same happens when it comes to the transition from metaphysics, a classical transcendental idealism, towards a post-metaphysics, a post-transcendentalism. Namely, that the Kantian problem, and sorry to introduce more here, we've done it in previous lectures, Kant essentially confronted philosophy with its own traumatic knowledge, which had to be fetishistically disavowed. When Kant proposes that the classic project of philosophy, to know truth, capital truth, cannot be achieved because the very concept of truth is therefore already a diminishing of the ideal. Namely, it is conceptualized through reason, i.e. the critique of pure reason, the impossibility of a reason which is pure, since reason is already that which is impure through conceptualization of the ideal. Kant essentially breaks transcendental philosophy. And Kant himself, hereby, is the neurotic who can't confront his own fetishistic disavowal. Kant sees the problem, which is that we can't know the ideal in a classic transcendental philosophy of sublimation. We can't exit the cave, for the very idea of the cave is already an idea, hence an illusion. And Kant therefore does this weird thing, which is that Kant upholds the notion of the thing in itself. Kant upholds the notion of an ideal which cannot be known, that exists outside of our reach, like behind a curtain. Hegel, if you will, is the perverted philosopher. Hegel is the philosopher who derives enjoyment from this lack of ideal content. Hegel looks at Kant and essentially says, you are confronted with the impossibility of pure reason, with the ideal content, namely what was supposed to be the whole point of the project of transcendental idealism. You're confronted with the impossibility, therefore, but you refuse to accept it. You become a neurotic who creates systems of antinomies. I am the pervert, essentially. I am the pervert who knows that there is no ideal content, but nevertheless, I will continue to create a system of idealism that elevates this absence into its own ideal. And that is what the Hegelian dialectic is. That is what the Hegelian idealism is. No longer an idealism of sublimation, but an idealism of desublimation. A post-metaphysical metaphysics. Or, if you will, a formalist anti-formalism. A dialectic of that which cannot be contained in the dialectic. The Hegelian project, therefore, is, for Žižek, the project of the pervert. Confronted with the fetishistic disavowal, the traumatic knowledge, which is necessitated by the traumatic knowledge of the unknowable object of ideal transcendentalism, namely the idea of the pure form, Kant devolves into neurotic fixation on the impossibility of empirically deducing it, creating charts, etc., antinomies. And Hegel looks at the same problem and decides to derive enjoyment from it, to extrapolate the whole precisely from that which is lacking. Hence, when Hegel is characterized as being this solipsistic thinker of the absolute, who has a preordained path by which everything in the world unfolds, it's actually the opposite. Hegel characterizes the absolute as something which is entirely contradictory, entirely impossible, entirely futile. And yet, precisely in this futility, it emerges. Hence the importance of the theological argument to Hegel. In the same way that Christ on the cross represents the moment by which sublimation emerges as desublimation, Hegel argues that the ideal, the whole, emerges only precisely by the fall into appearance as such. That which was considered antithetical to the ideal, namely the cave, suddenly becomes the way in which the ideal emerges in the first place. And so the transition from Kantian neurosis to Hegelian perversion is one of the core aspects or tenets of Žižek's philosophy. Hence why Žižek actually celebrates the pervert in a way as an important archetype of sorts. Of course, not a Jungian archetype. It's also why Žižek has his pervert's guide to cinema, etc. When Žižek uses the word pervert, he's not using it as a pejorative category. He's actually using it as almost like code for a Hegelian stance on truth. And I think that's actually quite important to emphasize, because often we think of perversion as simply like one of Žižek's favorite words. He loves using the word pervert. And of course, he's not always consistent with the idea. But essentially, that's the idea of the pervert versus the neurotic in its simplest form, which is that confronted with something which cannot be integrated into the symbolic universe or identity of the subject, it has to be fetishistically disavowed, either through neurotic fixation or through perverted enjoyment. And if the ideal content which sustains the notion of metaphysics is the notion of a pure form, then Kant is the one who, in the story of the idiot who realizes that the world is hurtling through space, realizes the fundamental problem of metaphysics, which is that the very notion of pure form is already conceptualized by reason, thereby rendering it impure, avant la lettre, or always already. Kant therefore fixates on this problem and becomes contented with it. But instead of trying to solve the problem, which cannot be solved, one has to make the leap towards perverted enjoyment of the problem and realizing the problem as itself the solution, namely the Hegelian position. This is also why Žižek, in his introduction to Less Than Nothing, says that this isn't so much the idiot's guide to Hegel as it is the imbecile's guide to Hegel. And for Žižek, the transition from idiot to imbecile is the transition from the neurotic to the pervert. Now, there's a lot more to explore here. So next week, what I'd like to do is I'd like to further think about the relationship of fetishistic disavowal to the commodity fetish. And that's when we'll piece together the final piece of the puzzle, which is how Žižek relates this notion of psychoanalysis and Hegelianism back to Marxism. Because one of the things that Žižek is most proud of in his work, and that I think is a really important contribution, is finding a relationship between the commodity fetish and fetishistic disavowal. And if you'd like to join me for that, I'm going to be here next week at 9 a.m. And you're very much invited to dip your toes into this philosophical water with me. Thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to download my ebook, which is a guide to Hegel and Žižek called The Night of the World, you can find it on my Patreon. Until then, I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.